Germany, 1628. A woman named Anna is dragged from her home at dawn. Her crime? A neighbor's cow died last week, and someone remembered that Anna had argued with its owner months ago. By nightfall, Anna will be stripped naked in front of strange men, her body searched for the devil's mark. Within days, she will confess to flying through the air, having sex with Satan, and murdering children she never met. She will name other women as her accomplices, and then she will burn. This is not a story about superstition. This is a story about what happens when fear becomes law, when suspicion becomes evidence, and when the people sworn to protect your soul become the ones who destroy your body.
Between 1400 and 1750, somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft across Europe. Some estimates run as high as 100,000. The vast majority were women. And the epicenter of this slaughter was not some remote backwater, but the heart of Christian civilization, the German-speaking lands of the Holy Roman Empire. To understand how this happened, we must first understand the book that made it possible. In 1486, a German priest named Heinrich Kramer published a treatise called Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. Kramer was an inquisitor who had become obsessed with the threat of witchcraft after failing to convict several women in the town of Innsbruck.
The local bishop had thrown him out, calling his methods unethical and his evidence worthless. Humiliated but undeterred, Kramer decided to write a manual that would make it impossible for any future judge to show such leniency. The Malleus Maleficarum became one of the most influential books in European history. Second only to the Bible in sales for nearly 2 centuries, it provided a complete system for identifying, prosecuting, and executing witches. It explained why women were more susceptible to the devil's influence. It described the sexual acts witches performed with demons, and most importantly, it provided step-by-step instructions for torture. The book's opening argument set the tone for everything that followed.
To deny the existence of witches, Kramer wrote, was itself heresy. Anyone who questioned whether witchcraft was real was defending the devil's servants. This meant that from the very beginning, the accused had no defenders. To speak in their favor was to condemn yourself. But Kramer understood that accusations alone would not be enough. He needed confessions, and confessions required methods. When a woman was accused of witchcraft, the first step was the search for the devil's mark. According to the Malleus, Satan branded his servants with a special mark somewhere on their bodies, a spot that would not bleed when pricked and would feel no pain. To find this mark, the accused was stripped completely naked. The instructions were specific. Women were to be stripped by other women of good reputation, though male officials would supervise. Every inch of the body was examined. Hair was shaved from every part, including the most intimate areas, because witches were known to hide talismans and charms in their hair. Then came the pricking. Using long needles, the examiners would stab the woman's body, searching for any spot that did not bleed or cause her to cry out. The problem, of course, was that the human body contains many areas of diminished sensitivity. Old scars, calluses, moles, and birthmarks could all fail to bleed sufficiently or respond to pain. And when examiners were being paid by the conviction, they had every incentive to find what they were looking for. If the search for marks was not conclusive, there were other tests. The most famous was the swimming test, or trial by water. The accused was stripped to her undergarments, her right thumb bound to her left toe and her left thumb to her right toe. Then she was thrown into a body of water, usually a river or pond, while ropes were tied around her waist. The logic was theological. Water, being the element of baptism, was pure and holy. It would naturally reject a servant of the devil. If the woman sank, she was innocent. If she floated, she was guilty. Think about this for a moment. If you sink, you are innocent,
but you may also drown.
If you float, which human bodies naturally tend to do, especially with air trapped in clothing, you are guilty. Either way, you have already been publicly stripped, bound, and humiliated in front of your entire community. Your reputation is destroyed, your family is shamed, and this is before the real torture begins. The Malleus Maleficarum provided detailed instructions for torture. The jailers were to prepare the implements. The prisoner was to be stripped again, this time by women of good reputation, to ensure no hidden charms protected her from pain. Then she was to be shown the instruments and given one final chance to confess before they were applied. The strappado was a common method.
The victim's hands were tied behind her back, and she was hoisted into the air by her wrists until her shoulders dislocated. Sometimes weights were attached to her feet to increase the agony. She would be raised and dropped repeatedly, each fall tearing at the already damaged joints. The rack stretched the body in opposite directions until bones separated and muscles tore. Thumb screws crushed the fingers and toes. The boots did the same to the feet and legs, sometimes shattering bones. Red-hot pincers tore flesh from the body. And through it all, the scribes recorded every scream, every plea, every name that escaped the victim's lips. Because that was the true purpose of torture. Not just confession, but more names.
Under unimaginable pain, victims would say anything to make it stop. They would confess to crimes they never committed. They would name neighbors, friends, even family members as fellow witches. And each new name meant a new arrest, a new trial, and more names still. This is how witch panic spread. In the town of Bamberg, Germany, between 1626 and 1631, authorities executed over 900 people for witchcraft. The population of the entire region was perhaps 25,000. Nearly 4% of the population was burned as witches in just 5 years. In Würzburg, during roughly the same period, the executions included the bishop's chancellor, several priests, and children as young as 7.
A Jesuit priest named Friedrich Spee served as confessor to many of the condemned. The experience turned his hair white before its time. He wrote later that not a single person he had accompanied to the stake had been guilty of anything. Every confession had been extracted through torture. Every accusation had been false. But Spee could not publish his conclusions openly. He feared that speaking against the witch trials would make him the next victim. So he circulated his book anonymously, hoping it might slow the killing. It was too little, too late. The witch trials disproportionately targeted certain types of women. The elderly were especially vulnerable. Widows who lived alone. Women who knew herbal remedies and served as healers and midwives. Women who were quarrelsome or outspoken. Women who were too poor to defend themselves or too unpopular to find advocates. But no one was truly safe. In some regions, the accusations climbed the social ladder, eventually reaching wealthy merchants, nobles, and clergy. Children were accused. Men were accused. Once the machinery of accusation was running, it consumed everything in its path. The economics of witch trials created their own momentum. In many jurisdictions, the accused was required to pay for her own imprisonment, her own torture, and even her own execution. Families were bankrupted. Property was seized. Those who profited from the trials, the judges, the torturers, the executioners, had every incentive to find more witches. Professional witch hunters emerged, men like Matthew Hopkins in England, who styled himself the Witch Finder General. Hopkins traveled from town to town, offering his services for a fee. He was paid for every witch he identified. In just 2 years,
He was responsible for the deaths of more people than had been executed for witchcraft in the previous century of English history combined. Hopkins favored a technique called watching and walking. The suspect was kept awake for days, forced to walk constantly until she collapsed from exhaustion.
Sleep deprivation produces hallucinations, paranoia, and eventually a kind of madness where victims will say anything, believe anything, just to be allowed to rest. Modern interrogators would recognize these techniques. They are still used today. The confessions extracted through these methods were remarkably consistent, not because they described real events, but because the interrogators knew what answers they wanted and would not stop until they got them. Victims confessed to flying through the air on broomsticks, to attending Sabbaths where they danced naked with the devil, to kissing Satan's backside as a sign of fealty, to murdering infants and using their fat to make flying ointment. None of this was real. All of it was believed.
The theological framework made the delusion complete. If witches existed, and the Bible said they did, then they must be identified and destroyed. If torture produced confessions, then the confessions must be true. If the confessions described impossible events, then the devil's power must be even greater than anyone had imagined. Every piece of evidence against witchcraft was somehow transformed into evidence for it. The methods of execution varied by region. In the German lands, burning was standard. Sometimes the condemned was strangled first as a mercy, sometimes not. In England, hanging was preferred. In Scotland, both burning and hanging were used. In all cases, the execution was public, a spectacle meant to demonstrate the power of the authorities and the fate awaiting anyone who trafficked with the devil. Families were often forced to watch. Sometimes they were required to pay for the wood that burned their mothers, daughters, and wives. The trials began to decline in the late 17th century, though the reasons were complex. Enlightenment thinking introduced new standards of evidence. Courts became more skeptical of confessions obtained through torture. Some judges simply grew exhausted with the endless cycle of accusation and execution. In England, the last execution for witchcraft occurred in 1682. In Scotland, 1727. In Germany, the trials continued longer in some areas, with the last documented execution occurring in 1775 in Poland. By then, the intellectual climate had shifted. What had once seemed like righteous defense against evil now looked like mass murder. The total death toll will never be precisely known. Records are incomplete. Many trials were never documented. Many victims died in prison before they could be formally executed. But even the conservative estimates represent an almost incomprehensible horror. 40,000 women, perhaps 60,000, perhaps more. Think about what that number means. These were not enemy soldiers killed in battle. These were not criminals convicted of actual crimes. These were women, mostly women, killed by their own communities, their own churches, their own governments, for crimes that do not exist. The witch trials reveal something disturbing about human nature. When people are afraid, they look for explanations. When crops fail, when children die, when plague sweeps through a community, someone must be to blame. And the easiest targets are always those with the least power to defend themselves. The poor, the elderly, the outcast, the different. The church provided the theological framework, the state provided the legal machinery, and ordinary people, driven by fear, superstition, and sometimes simple malice, provided the accusations. Together, they created a system that could turn any woman into a witch, any neighbor into an enemy, any community into a killing field. What makes this history especially troubling is how respectable it all was. These were not lynch mobs, or at least not always. These were courts. These were priests. These were educated men following procedures laid out in printed books, recording their proceedings in careful Latin, convinced that they were doing God's work. The torturer believed he was saving souls. The judge believed he was protecting the community. The executioner believed he was purifying the world. And the crowd that gathered to watch a woman burn believed they were witnessing justice.
This is what makes the witch trials not just a historical curiosity, but a permanent warning. Evil does not always announce itself. It does not always wear obvious costumes or speak in obvious ways. Sometimes it wears robes. Sometimes it carries crosses. Sometimes it quotes scripture and follows procedure and keeps careful records. The women who burned were real. They had names and families and lives that were stolen from them. Agnes and Anna and Maria, and thousands whose names are lost to history. They were accused by neighbors who feared them, condemned by priests who despised them, and killed by authorities who never doubted they were right.
And when it was over, when the last flames died down and the last ashes scattered in the wind, life went on. The judges returned to their courts, the priests returned to their altars, the neighbors returned to their fields, and the dead remained dead. The Malleus Maleficarum is still in print. You can buy a copy today. It sits on library shelves alongside other historical documents, a reminder of what people once believed and what they were willing to do in the name of that belief. Some things change, some things do not. We no longer burn witches, but we have never stopped looking for them. We have never stopped finding enemies among the powerless, scapegoats among the outcasts, devils among those who are simply different.
The methods change, the targets change, the justifications change, but the fear remains. And as long as there is fear, there will be those who profit from it, those who exploit it, those who turn it into law and procedure and official action. The witch trials teach us that civilization is no protection against barbarism, that faith is no guarantee of mercy, that the worst atrocities are often committed by people who believe they are doing good. The women who died cannot speak for themselves. The records that survive were written by their killers, but their silence itself is testimony. They were not witches. They were women, and they deserved better than the world gave them.